My name is Sierra Langston, I am 30 years old. I still remember the exact moment the floor seemed to tilt under my feet, not because of any dramatic explosion, but because the person who had always claimed to protect me looked straight at me and rewrote the truth as if my memory had never existed. If you have ever sat across from someone you loved and watched them calmly erase years of shared history while expecting you to nod along, tell me in the comments what that moment felt like for you. Were you at work, at home, or somewhere in between when the first crack appeared? It began on an ordinary Tuesday in late spring inside the small open-plan office I shared with two other independent real estate consultants on the third floor of a renovated brick building near the Boise River. Afternoon light was pouring through the tall windows, and I was finishing a client proposal when the glass door swung open without a knock. My older sister stood there in a tailored blazer, her expression already set in the particular mixture of concern and superiority she had perfected over the years. She did not wait for me to speak. She closed the door behind her, placed a thin folder on my desk, and said in a low, even voice that the family property records needed immediate clarification because the bank had flagged an inconsistency. I asked what property she meant. She answered that the riverfront cabin our parents had always called a modest weekend place had never been sold the way my mother once told me. According to the documents she slid toward me, the cabin still sat under a joint ownership structure that listed my name as a minority holder, and the current market value had climbed far higher than anyone had admitted. I stared at the papers. Years earlier my mother had looked me in the eye at a quiet kitchen table and explained that the cabin had been transferred to cover medical costs after my father's brief hospital stay, that the numbers were small, and that there was nothing left for any of us to worry about. I had accepted the story because I trusted her. Now my older sister was telling me the story had been incomplete at best and deliberately incomplete at worst. She leaned forward and spoke the next sentences with the calm authority of someone who had already decided the outcome. The bank required updated signatures to keep the account in good standing, and because I lived alone and had recently taken a few sick days after a routine blood pressure check that came back slightly elevated, it made sense for her to handle the practical side. She suggested I sign a limited authorization so the paperwork could move without further delay. When I hesitated, she added that hesitation itself could look like instability to the lenders, and that the family could not afford another round of questions. I felt the familiar pressure settle across my shoulders, the same pressure I had felt whenever decisions were framed as urgent family necessities that somehow always required my signature and never my full understanding. I asked why the truth about the cabin had been kept from me for so long. My older sister's answer was measured and almost gentle. She said my mother had wanted to spare me worry while I was building my own career, and that the details had simply never seemed important until the bank notice arrived. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, yet every sentence rearranged the ground I stood on. When she finally left, the folder remained on my desk like a small, heavy accusation. I sat very still for a long time, listening to the river traffic outside and trying to decide whether the lie had begun with my mother or had simply been maintained by my older sister once it proved useful. That evening I called the only person I trusted enough to say the words out loud. Holly Grimes answered on the second ring, her voice steady in the way only a long friendship can make steady. I told her everything the papers claimed and everything my older sister had asked me to sign. Holly listened without interrupting, then asked one quiet question: had I ever seen the original deed or the bank statements myself? I admitted I had not. She suggested I stop answering further calls from my older sister until I had independent information, and she offered the name of a private investigator she had once used for a property dispute of her own. I wrote down the name Cole Brennan and felt the first small shift from confusion towards something colder and more deliberate. The next morning I drove to his modest office on the edge of downtown Boise, the kind of place that smelled of coffee and paper rather than polished marble. I placed the folder on his desk and explained that I needed to know whether the ownership structure and the earlier sale story matched any public records. He took the file without drama and told me the preliminary search would take several days. While I waited, the secondary pressure arrived exactly as my older sister had hinted it might. My primary care doctor's office called to schedule a follow-up on the elevated reading from the previous month. The nurse's tone was neutral, yet the timing felt deliberate, as if the universe itself had decided to test how easily I could be painted as someone who needed managing. I kept the appointment, listened to the doctor's ordinary advice about rest and monitoring, and left with a clear statement that nothing required emergency intervention or outside oversight. Still, the conversation with my older sister continued in shorter, sharper messages. She wrote that the bank deadline was approaching, that further delay would reflect poorly on all of us, and that my recent health note made it practical for her to keep temporary control of the paperwork. Each message carried the same calm insistence that I was being difficult by asking questions. 2 days later Cole Brennan called. His voice remained professional, but the report he summarized changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. The cabin had never been sold. The earlier story my mother had given me did not match any recorded transaction. Ownership had stayed intact, and the value had risen steadily while I was told there was nothing left. More than that, recent correspondence between the bank and my older sister showed she had already begun positioning herself as the primary decision-maker, citing my limited involvement and the need for family stability. I sat in my car outside his office after the call ended and watched the late afternoon light move across the river. The loyalty I had counted on for years had been an illusion carefully maintained by the two people who should have had the least reason to maintain it. My mother had spoken the first incomplete version. My older sister had kept the incomplete version alive and was now using it to claim practical authority over an asset I had been taught no longer existed. I drove home in silence, the private investigator summary printed and folded in my bag. That night I did not answer the 3 calls that came from my older sister's number. I did not open the messages that followed. Instead, I opened a new notebook and began writing down every date, every claim, and every contradiction I could remember. The act felt small, almost ordinary, yet it was the first clear boundary I had drawn in years. By the time the sun rose over the foothills the next morning, I understood that the confrontation in my office had not been a request for help. It had been the opening move in a quieter campaign to rewrite both the property record and my place inside the family that claimed to value me. The notebook stayed open on my kitchen table through the next 2 days while the unanswered calls from my older sister accumulated into a quiet stack of notifications I refused to clear. I kept the private investigator summary folded inside the front cover and read it again each morning, letting the dates and ownership entries settle into something solid enough to stand on. On the 3rd morning a new message arrived, this time from my mother's number. The tone was softer than my older sister's had been, almost apologetic, yet the content moved in the same direction. She wrote that the bank situation had grown more complicated overnight and that the family needed a unified front so the lenders would not question anyone's judgment. She asked me to meet her for coffee at a neutral cafe downtown so we could talk without the pressure of formal paperwork. I agreed to the meeting because I still hoped the incomplete story might have an explanation that did not require deliberate silence. We sat at a corner table near the window, the afternoon light flat and ordinary. My mother began by saying she had only wanted to keep the details simple after my father's hospital stay years earlier, that the numbers had seemed small at the time, and that she had never intended the cabin to become a source of conflict. When I asked why the sale she once described had never appeared in any public record, her answer slowed. She said the transfer had been more complicated than she remembered, that my older sister had helped manage the practical side, and that the important thing now was to protect the asset rather than revisit old paperwork. I listened without interrupting. The same calm voice that had once told me there was nothing left was now telling me the nothing had always been something, and that the something required my signature to remain secure. When I said I needed time to review the full history myself, her expression shifted into the familiar mixture of worry and mild disappointment. She mentioned the recent blood pressure note in my medical file and suggested that stress might be clouding my ability to see the practical path forward. The comment landed with quiet precision. A routine health reading had become evidence that I required guidance. I left the cafe with the same folder I had carried in and the growing certainty that the loyalty I had counted on had been shaped by convenience rather than care. That evening Holly called again. She had spoken with Cole Brennan on my behalf after I forwarded the latest messages, and she had something additional to send. A short email arrived 20 minutes later containing scanned correspondence between the bank and my older sister that predated the Tuesday confrontation by nearly 6 weeks. In those earlier messages, my older sister had already described me as only lightly involved and had offered to serve as the primary contact for all future decisions. The language was careful, professional, and entirely consistent with someone preparing the ground before the first direct request for my signature. The proof arrived from the one person I had trusted enough to ask for help, and it removed the last soft edges from the story I had been told. I sat with the new documents for a long time, the river sounds faint through the open window, and understood that the campaign had not begun in my office. It had been underway while I still believed the cabin belonged to no one. The following week the pressure tightened in smaller, more ordinary ways. My older sister began copying my coworker Evan Marks on brief emails that referenced family property coordination and asked whether my recent schedule changes might affect availability for signatures. Evan forwarded the messages to me with a single line of concern and no further comment. The inclusion of a professional contact felt deliberate, a quiet expansion of the circle in which my reliability could be questioned. I answered none of the copied threads. Instead, I scheduled a consultation with the attorney Priya Knoll, whose name Cole Brennan had recommended for matters involving unclear ownership and potential misrepresentation. Priya's office was small and unadorned. She reviewed the private investigator report, the bank correspondence, and the medical note that had been referenced so carefully by both my mother and my older sister. Her questions were precise. She asked whether I had ever signed any prior authorization, whether the cabin generated income one had been told about, and whether any family member had ever presented me with a complete accounting. Each answer I gave confirmed the pattern of limited information. She explained that the combination of incomplete disclosure and the recent attempt to secure my signature under time pressure created a record worth preserving, and she advised me to formalize a written boundary before any further documents were presented. I left her office with a short letter drafted in careful language. The letter stated that I would not sign any authorization related to the cabin until I had received a full and independent accounting of ownership history, current value, and all prior communications with the bank. It also requested that my medical information remain outside any family discussion of financial matters. I sent the letter by certified mail to both my mother and my older sister and kept the receipt in the same notebook that now held every contradiction. The response came within 48 hours. My older sister called 3 times in a single afternoon. When I finally answered, her voice carried a new edge beneath the familiar calm. She said the letter had complicated an already delicate situation with the lenders, that my insistence on independent review looked like distrust, and that the family could not afford public questions about stability. She mentioned again the elevated reading from my doctor's office and suggested that stress was making me see motives where none existed. I told her the letter stood. She ended the call without agreement. Later that night a final message arrived from my mother. The words were brief and almost weary. She wrote that she had only ever tried to keep peace, that my older sister was better at handling practical details, and that she hoped I would reconsider before the bank took further action. The message contained no apology for the original incomplete story and no offer of the full records I had requested. It simply asked me to soften the boundary I had drawn. I placed the phone face down and returned to the notebook. The entries now stretched across multiple pages: the first confrontation, the cafe conversation, the predated bank correspondence, the copied emails to my coworker, the medical note turned into leverage, and the quiet refusal to supply the accounting I had asked for. Each line confirmed the same shape. The loyalty I had believed in had been an arrangement that worked only while I asked no questions. The next morning Cole Brennan sent one additional finding. A short title search update showed that a secondary lien discussion had begun 2 months earlier between the bank and my older sister, a discussion that listed her as the contact of record and made no reference to my ownership interest. The timing placed the preparation well before any claimed urgency. I printed the update and added it to the growing file. By the end of that week, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every request for my signature had been framed as protection. Every reference to my health had been framed as concern. Every delay in providing records had been framed as practical necessity. Yet the private documents told a different sequence: preparation, limited disclosure, and steady pressure once the first refusal appeared. I sat at the kitchen table with the complete set of papers spread in front of me and made the first irreversible decision of the process. I would not attend any further informal meetings. I would not respond to any further requests for authorization. I would let the written boundary stand and accept whatever consequence followed from the silence. The choice felt neither dramatic nor triumphant. It simply felt like the only ground that still belonged to me. That evening the phone remained quiet for the first time in days. The absence of new messages did not bring relief. It only marked the space where the next move would eventually appear. The quiet lasted only until the following Monday, when a formal notice from the bank arrived by certified mail and forced the next movement into the open. The letter stated that a scheduled review of the riverfront cabin account required confirmation of all listed owners within 10 business days, and that failure to respond could result in temporary restrictions on the associated line of credit. My older sister had already replied on behalf of the family, listing herself as the coordinating contact and noting that one minority holder remained difficult to reach. The language was polite, precise, and entirely consistent with the pattern the private investigator documents had already revealed. I forwarded the notice to Priya Knoll the same afternoon. She reviewed it within the hour and confirmed that my written boundaries still protected me from any claim of abandonment or obstruction. She also advised that remaining silent was now the clearest way to keep the record clean. I followed that advice. I filed the bank letter beside the earlier correspondence and made no further reply. 2 days later my mother called. Her voice carried the same soft urgency it had held in the cafe, yet the content had hardened. She said the bank review was creating unnecessary stress for everyone, that my older sister was managing the practical side effectively, and that continued silence from me would only confirm the impression that I was unwilling to cooperate. When I repeated that I would not sign any authorization without a complete independent accounting, she paused for a long moment and then said something I had never heard from her before. She told me the original decision to keep the cabin details limited had been made together with my older sister years earlier because they both believed I was better left outside the heavier responsibilities. The admission landed without apology. It simply confirmed that the incomplete story had been a deliberate choice rather than a forgotten detail. I ended the call without argument. The notebook now held the final piece of the sequence I had been tracing: the early agreement to limit my knowledge, the maintained silence, the sudden urgency once the bank required signatures, and the quiet use of a routine health note to question my capacity. Loyalty had never been the foundation. Convenience had been. That evening Holly stopped by with takeout and the kind of steady presence that requires no performance. I told her the bank notice had arrived and that I intended to let the boundary stand. She listened, then said she understood why I needed distance, yet she also admitted the ongoing tension had begun to spill into her own conversations with mutual acquaintances. Evan Marks had already asked her once whether the family property situation might affect my availability at work. The question was casual, but the fact that it had been asked at all showed how far the circle of awareness had expanded. I thanked her for the honesty and told her I would stop sharing updates so the situation would not continue to touch the people who had only tried to help. The decision cost something. It placed a quiet space between us that had not existed before. Cole Brennan sent one last summary 3 days later. The title search was complete. No sale had ever been recorded. The ownership structure had remained unchanged for more than a decade. Secondary discussions between the bank and my older sister had continued without any formal notice to me until the recent push for signatures. The report closed the factual questions. What remained was only the personal cost of accepting the answers. I spent the following weekend alone in my apartment, the river visible from the window, the file of documents stacked neatly on the table. On Sunday afternoon I opened a sealed envelope I had found months earlier while sorting old papers after my father's brief hospital stay. I had set it aside at the time, assuming it contained ordinary medical correspondence. Inside was a short handwritten note dated nearly 8 years earlier, written in my mother's careful script and addressed to my older sister. The note thanked her for agreeing that the cabin details should stay limited, that I was building my own path and did not need the added weight, and that keeping the information simple would prevent unnecessary worry. The letter was ordinary in its language and devastating in its clarity. It showed the arrangement had been intentional from the beginning. I read the page twice, then placed it with the rest of the file. The hidden letter did not create a path to confrontation or recovery. It simply removed the last possibility that the silence had been accidental. The knowledge settled into a quiet, permanent place. On Monday I drafted a final statement with Priya Noel's guidance. The letter restated that I would not participate in any further decisions regarding the cabin, that all prior incomplete disclosures were now documented, and that any future contact on the matter should be directed solely through formal legal channels. I sent copies to my mother, my older sister, and the bank. I kept the certified receipts. After the letters left my hands I blocked both family numbers and closed the email thread that had carried the earlier messages. The response was silence. No further calls arrived. No additional bank notices reached me. The cabin remained under the control of the people who had always managed it. I received nothing from the asset and claimed nothing. The professional relationships that had brushed against the conflict grew more distant by quiet agreement. Holly and I still spoke, yet the conversations stayed carefully away from family ground. Evan Marks stopped forwarding messages and simply treated the subject as closed. The distance was not dramatic. It was simply the practical result of choosing not to pull others further into a situation that no longer required witnesses. In the weeks that followed I returned to ordinary work, ordinary appointments, and the ordinary rhythm of living alone in a city that asked nothing of me except the rent. The elevated blood pressure reading resolved with the same rest the doctor had recommended. No one referenced it again. The private investigator file stayed in a locked drawer. I did not reopen it. Some evenings the knowledge of the long arrangement still rose without warning, a brief tightening in the chest that passed once I reminded myself the boundary was holding. There was no public reckoning, no restored trust, and no financial recovery. There was only the steady fact that I no longer answered requests framed as family necessity and no longer measured my stability by someone else's description of it. The choice left me outside the circle that had once claimed to include me. It also left me free of the obligation to keep performing loyalty toward an arrangement that had never included the full truth. I do not know whether the cabin will eventually be sold or refinanced or simply held. I no longer track the details. The silence I maintain is not punishment. It is the only form of peace that has proven durable. I chose the boundary knowing it would cost the relationships that had already rewritten my place inside them. I carry no guilt for the choice. The cost was real, the isolation is real, and the quiet that followed is the only ground that still belongs entirely to me. Thank you for staying with me through the whole of this. If you found yourself in a similar place, standing between a long pattern of incomplete truth and the decision to step outside it, what would you choose?